Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and this is part 15 of my Kobolds and Catacombs card review. This time around I only have 4 new cards, but I do have the Rogue Legendary Weapon, which is a pretty exciting one. So up first I'll be doing my detailed reviews. If you're someone who doesn't have a lot of time, you can hit the link in the description to go to my quick reviews at the end of the video, where I'll be rating each card from 1 to 5 stars. But right now, let's go ahead and jump into my detailed reviews. Up first, I have that Rogue Legendary Weapon. This is one of the Kingslayers. This is Kingsbane, a 1-mana 1/3 with a really cool effect. It reads Death Rattle. Shuffle this into your deck. It keeps any enchantments. That means any buffs you place on this weapon, think plus attack or poisonous or lifesteal. Once it's broken and you redraw this weapon, it comes preloaded with each of those effects, making it an incredibly good 1-drop. Even if, for instance, you just put like Deadly Poison on Kingsbane, that's a 3/3 weapon for 1 mana, which is totally insane. If it's got lifesteal or poisonous or anything else, even more attack than that thanks to other cards, it becomes absurd really quickly. So obviously there's a couple implications there. First, you add a really powerful high-tempo card into your deck after you play Kingsbane. That's certainly a positive in its favor. You also never really run out of cards, because essentially you can always prevent fatigue with a card like this outside of some deck-destroying effects that exist in the game by playing a Kingsbane and then equipping your weapon, and you just always have a card to draw. So it's in some ways like a little bit of a Jade Idol card there. It might not always give you a ton of value in that scenario, like it's not going to be enough to just kill your opponent or kill their board of stuff, potentially depending on the board state, but still, you would never actually take fatigue damage if you did this correctly. So in certain decks that could matter. I don't think that's really a great application for the card, but certainly a very interesting interaction, that it's almost an anti-fatigue style card in a way. And then finally, it's also sometimes just a 1-mana 1/3 weapon, which is actually okay. Light's Justice isn't a card that sees play a ton in Paladin, but it's not bad by any means. Just having those extra pings at a discount compared to your hero power can go a long way. So all of those are very strong positives in this card's favor. That said, I do think this card has some downsides that not everybody is addressing or recognizing properly, because a lot of people seem pretty hyped about this card and the fact that it can go infinite. But the problem for me with Kingsbane is that you have to run some pretty bad cards in your deck to make this one good. So, for instance, Envenom Weapon, not really a card that we see very often. Leeching Poison, not a card we see very often. So there are clearly some weapon buffs in the game that just don't see very much play and look like weak cards. So in other words, is it worth it to run those cards just for Kingsbane? Even Deadly Poison, it's a little better, it sees some play here and there, but not something we see a lot today. But is it worth it to run all those just to buff your Kingsbane? Because your Kingsbane could be card 30 in your deck. It might not be the kind of thing you draw. So in some ways, Kingsbane might be that sort of Keleseth style card that if you get it early and you draw some weapon buffs to buff it up, it becomes really powerful because it's just always going back into your deck. But even then, once it goes back into your deck, do you draw it again or do you just waste those weapon buffs? Like, games don't last forever. So the way we see Rogue today, which is a little bit faster of a tempo Rogue, I don't know that Kingsbane fits very well in that list. Perhaps it makes sense that a Miracle Rogue is just another tool where you can more consistently use those spells to draw cards, and you're more likely to draw into those spells or into Kingsbane itself because you're drawing more cards. It could perhaps work in that environment. But still, there's a lot of ordering issues. You get your buffs first. You have to use them on your hero power weapon just to spend your mana and just to stay alive and just to get some value and spend some mana in this game to actually compete. If so, then you draw your Kingsbane. You may not have any weapon buffs left. Everything might have came in the wrong order. If you draw your Kingsbane first and don't draw any weapon buffs, it's just you're adding another 1-mana 1/3 into your deck, which is okay, but is kind of a dead draw in the mid to late game because it's just a 1-mana 1/3. So there's a lot of consistency problems with a card like this to make it work. There might be a really finely tuned list eventually that somebody discovers that runs less compromising cards, like maybe just Deadly Poison and Southsea Squidface, to get some real value out of Kingsbane. But I think that's going to be a huge challenge, and I think it's going to be hard to build a deck to support this one perfectly. Clearly, this card is good at a base level. It does cool things. It has a lot of upside. It's low-costed. It makes a ton of sense in and of itself, but the support it requires to make it viable in an actual deck and make it competitive, I think is a huge challenge. And even more challenging, for instance, than something like Keleseth. Because Keleseth's always good when you draw him. Kingsbane's not always good just when you draw it. You have to get those other pieces for it to make sense, and you still have to draw it. So not something you can necessarily build a deck around. You might only be able to run, 2, 3, or 4 supporting cards to make this one really good. And then the upside potential of a card like this is hampered a little as well. So outside of maybe some mill rogue that needs that anti-fatigue condition, I don't think we're going to see Kingsbane a lot right away. It might be the kind of card that pops in from time to time. It has that potential and that huge upside to do some cool stuff. But the consistency issues for me hold this one back more than I think most people are willing to admit. So now let's move on to another weapon. This is a warrior weapon this time around. Not a legendary weapon, mind you. This is the Bladed Gauntlet, a 2-mana 0/2 weapon. And it has attack equal to your armor. And it can't attack heroes. So I think pretty clearly this is designed as a sort of pseudo replacement for Fiery War Axe, a kind of cheap card that can allow you to trade into minions fairly efficiently. But that said, I really think it falls very, very short of Fiery War Axe. And the reason for that is Fiery War Axe has a consistent, predictable attack value. Bladed Gauntlet here has a lot of risk that, in fact, it might not have any attack at all. There can be a lot of instances where you want to play this and you don't have armor, especially on turn 2. It can be very difficult to get armor by turn 2. Like turn 1, you don't have that many ways to armor up. There's very, very few unless you have the coin. In fact, maybe none on turn 2 if you don't have the coin. And then, of course, if you're hero powering on 2, you're not playing Bladed Gauntlet until 3, so there's mana problem there, conflict there. If you're playing its fast decks, where I think you want to use this the most to control the early game because it is a 2-cost card, then usually they've chipped away at your health total through the early to mid game anyway. So outside of like a turn 5 play where you shield block and play Bladed Gauntlet to trade into a medium-sized thing, sometimes it's going to be really hard to activate this in the early to mid game when I think it would excel the most. So what that means is this is sort of relegated towards a late game card. And you can, like I said, combo it out with other armor gaining cards in a single turn to trade into some medium-sized things. It is a nice, cheap sort of removal in that context. Unlike something like Gorehowl, for instance, which is similarly great at removing mid-sized things or even big things from time to time. But Gorehowl costs 7 mana, Bladed Gauntlet only costs 2, so you can see how that could provide you some sort of tempo or flexibility advantage in the mid to late game where you can kind of slot this in on top of armor gain or on top of other threats and still do something to contribute to the board. That's really the only context this makes sense to me, but I don't know that Warrior needs that necessarily. We don't know exactly what Warrior is going to look like in the new expansion. Warrior is in a weird place right now where there's not a dominant deck or even a competitive deck at all. Deadman's Hand's the closest thing, and that doesn't even feel very competitive at all to me. So I think this would be better if it was a weapon that was great in the early game, and I just don't see how Bladed Gauntlet's going to be great in the early game. It's not going to serve as that Fiery War Axe replacement. Warrior already has a lot of tools in the late game, so I don't know that Bladed Gauntlet's going to be good enough to make the cut. I think it's competing against a lot of other great cards. It's not going to carve out a niche for itself. It's not going to be that Fiery War Axe replacement, so I don't really see this one seeing a ton of play. I think it's going to fall short compared to other options. So up next, let's move on to a new Druid card. This is Oaken Summons, a new 4-mana spell that reads gain 6 armor and recruit a minion that costs 4 or less. So it's pretty easy to do the math on this card right off the bat. It's a 4-mana spell. You're getting a 4-mana minion, so that right there feels good, right? That's an equal cost efficiency. Plus, of course, you gain the 6 armor, so it's kind of like sometimes you're getting that 6 armor for free. If you look at this just from that standpoint, just the basic equation, Oaken Summons looks like a solid card. It certainly makes sense. The math all adds up. Unfortunately, in the reality of things, I don't think it's quite that simple. First and foremost, of course, there are minions that cost 4 or less that could potentially be in your deck. So if you really want to guarantee that this thing makes sense, you have to run only 4 or higher cost minions. That's not usually a giant problem for big druid or jade druid kinds of decks, more control oriented late game style druids. Normally they don't really run any minions that cost less than 4 outside of the occasional doomsayer. Most of their stuff is spells and early game ramp or removal options. So that's probably not that big of a challenge to overcome in the kinds of decks that would want to run this. I think the bigger challenge, the harder thing for this to overcome, is that most of the minions that Druid does run right now that cost 4 mana don't really do all that much immediately as a recruit option because they're typically either combo or battle cry card, or not combo, excuse me, choose one or battle cry cards. You can think like Mire Keeper and Jade Spirit are probably the two most common 4-drops right now as far as minions are concerned in Druid, neither of which you'd want to pull off Oaken Summons. So in the context of today, in the meta right now, Oaken Summons is almost certainly not a playable card. You get Fandral as maybe the only good predictable 4-drop, there's some potential there to just always tutor out your Fandral if Fandral's the only 4-drop in your deck, but that is going to hurt both Jade and Big Druid because you have to cut Mire Keeper and Jade Spirit, both of which are fairly important to each of their lists. So the Fandral play kind of makes sense, but still I don't think is actually going to be how we see this one utilized. So essentially what I'm saying is that since I think the archetypes that are popular in Druid right now, at least the control archetypes, we're not talking about token, because this is definitely not a token card. It's far too defensive for what token is looking for. But those archetypes right now don't want to run this card. But that said, they are going to rotate out eventually. Things like Yashiraj and Jades are rotating out in like 4 months at the next yearly rotation. So then this is the kind of card that I think could become relevant. If Druid gets some more 4-drops or some great 4-drop taunts, which I don't think their most recently revealed one will suit that need, but there might be others, then this card could start to make sense in a really defensively minded Druid. Druid's getting a lot of like armor gain cards. So as we see Druid shift and change with the next rotation, keep an eye on Oaken Summons. It's not going to see a ton of play right away, I don't think, but in the future, this is the kind of card that does make some sense. It has a ton of defensive potential, and the right 4-drop or even a couple 4-drops that really make sense for Oaken Summons would be a huge increase in consistency by always being able to pull those out and gain some extra armor on top. That's something Druid would love to do, so I wouldn't be surprised to see Oaken Summons in the future at all. And then finally here, I have one last card. This is a new Paladin card, the Crystal Lion. A 6-mana 5/5 that has Divine Shield. It also gets a cost reduction. It costs 1 less for each Silverhand recruit that you control. So in some ways, I think you could compare this card almost immediately to something like Thing from Below. It gets a discount based on some other mechanic. It's a 6-mana 5/5. Instead of Taunt, it has Divine Shield. Divine Shield is typically much, much better than Taunt just because it allows it to trade and absorb more hits and make it more likely that it goes 2 for 1 against other cards. The problem, of course, with Crystal Lion, as in there's always a but, is that this is not based on a over-time, long-term Silverhand recruit summoning, as is Thing from Below with totems. In other words, it retains its discount every time you summon a totem, no matter how far into the game you get, and you don't have to have the totems on board. With Crystal Lion, you have to have the Silverhand recruits on board. They have to be in your control. So it's much, much harder of a condition to satisfy because it doesn't add up over time. You're not banking that discount. It has to be an active discount on that given turn. And that's a really big challenge to overcome. That's hard because keeping multiple recruits out over time is difficult. There are, of course, ways to summon recruits instantly in Hearthstone. Things like Stand Against Darkness in standard format and Lost in the Jungle in standard format. Wild also has Muster for Battle, of course, which is really good. So there are some ways to combo out Crystal Lion kind of in a single turn for a bigger swing. And in fact, Stand Against Darkness is a pretty solid way to do that. You could spend essentially 5 mana to gain a 5 mana discount on Crystal Lion. And then you have a pretty baller turn 6, right? A bunch of 1/1s and a 5/5 with Divine Shield. That's really, really good. Of course, the challenge there, and there's always a challenge, is that you have to get both those cards at the same time. You have to be in a board state where that makes sense. Your opponent still can remove those 1/1s, and of course, typically AoEs that deal well with 1/1s also deal well with Divine Shield. So there's a little bit of counter synergy there, making this still a 1-mana 5/5, which is obviously a great play. But Stand Against Darkness has not been a successful card in standard format. So are you running a sort of bad or unsuccessful or lower opportunity card in order to make Crystal Lion work? Maybe so. But still, that said, there are obviously some huge swing potentials and tempo potentials on a card like this, so I do think it's one to keep an eye on. Outside of that exact scenario with like Stand Against Darkness or even Lost in the Jungle, this card becomes much, much worse. There's very rarely more than 1 or 2 lingering Silverhand recruits, And a 5-mana 5/5 with Divine Shield is a solid play. Like, that's not by any means terrible. That's okay, even in Standard. And a 4-mana 5/5 with Divine Shield is pretty good. I don't know that it's strong enough. There's a lot of strong plays in Hearthstone. You have to kind of be overpowered in a lot of your turns. Is this worse, for instance, than just Spike Ridge Steed? Also at the similar kind of 6-mana cost. Probably not, because it's really a 4 or 5-mana card sometimes. So there's some competition for it to overcome, but still... the consistency goes down a lot without some of those one-turn combo opportunities because, you know, outside of Lost in the Jungle, which makes this essentially a 4-mana card, which is okay, and Standing Against Darkness, which makes it a 1-mana card, which is awesome, it's probably always going to be 5 or 6 mana, and 5 or 6 mana is way less exciting than 4 or 3 or 2, etc., etc. So essentially the question for me becomes, how often is this going to be discounted in a major way, and is it worth it if it's not happening consistently all the time? And is the deck that discounts it constantly good enough to compete in Hearthstone today? Those are the hurdles it has to jump over, and I think it's going to have trouble doing that. In Wild format and in Arena, I think this card's going to be incredible. I don't think it's going to make the cut right now in Standard. Maybe it's another one of those cards that as we rotate in and the meta shifts, it could become powerful. It has all the potential to make a big impact. It's one of those high potential cards. It's just going to take a little time for that to come to fruition, but certainly another one of those cards to keep your eye on. And there we go, folks. That's it for my detailed reviews on those 4 cards. So what I'd like to do now is go through and give each of these cards a rating from 1 to 5 stars. Kingsbane is a 3-star card. Bladed Gauntlet is a 2-star card. Oaken Summons is a 3-star card. And Crystal Lion is a 3-star card. So that wraps it up. That's part 15 of my Kobolds and Catacombs card review. I know some people out there think 3-star ratings might be cop-outs, and I gave a handful of cards 3 stars here, but essentially, I'm saying that, you know, these cards are okay at a fundamental level. They just aren't going to make the cut right now. So it's hard to say they're going to be 1-star cards in this meta and then 5-star cards in the next. That doesn't feel very fair to me to do. So since these cards have some inherent qualities and look like fundamentally like they make sense in the context of Hearthstone, eventually I'm giving them 3 stars. They're not quite 2 stars, not quite 4 stars. They're just middle of the road right now with the potential to become more. So keep that in mind. But that said, I'm curious what you guys think. Which of these cards are going to make the biggest impact? Is Kingsbane actually super OP and I'm just missing it? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.